At 11:15 on the morning of August 31st, 1944, Private James Rookard stood beside his 2.5-ton GMC truck at a fuel depot 50 miles east of Paris. Watching Lieutenant General George Patton's Third Army grind to a complete stop, Rookard was 19 years old. He had been in France for 8 weeks. He was a truck driver with the 514th Quartermaster Regiment. And at that moment, he was witnessing something that should have been impossible. The most aggressive, fastest-moving army in American history had just run out of gas. Patton's Third Army had covered 400 meters in 30 days. They had liberated Paris. They had chased the German army across France. They were 30 meters from the German border. Poised to punch straight into the heart of the Third Reich, the German army was shattered, running, desperate. One more push, and the war might be over by Christmas. But Patton's tanks were empty. His trucks were empty. His entire army spread across northeastern France had consumed every drop of fuel in the supply system. Third Army had requested 400,000 gallons of gasoline for that day. They received 31,000. Without fuel, the most powerful mechanized force ever assembled was just expensive metal sitting in French fields. The Germans were not sitting still. Patton knew it. His staff knew it. Every delay, every hour, the Third Army stayed motionless. Gave the Germans time to regroup, time to build defenses, time to turn a rout into a fight. The question wasn't whether the Germans would recover, but it existed in the wrong place. It sat offshore in tankers, or in 55-gallon drums stacked on the beaches, or in depots hundreds of miles to the rear. The question wasn't whether the Allies had enough fuel. The question was whether they could get it to the men who needed it before momentum collapsed. Rookard didn't know any of that. What he knew was that he'd spent the last 3 nights sleeping in the cab of his truck, waiting for an order that never came. Watching the line of vehicles snake back toward the water like a steel river that had run dry, he knew that the men at the front were begging for gasoline. That staff officers yelled at each other in a dozen accents, and that everyone drivers, mechanics. Quartermasters felt the same pressure. Keep Patton moving. So on that morning of August 31st, when an officer finally appeared with a clipboard and shouted, "We're rolling. Fuel run to Chartres. Load what you can carry," Rookard didn't question it. He turned the engine over, felt the vibrations settle into the wheel, and eased into the convoy. What he couldn't see from where he sat was that he had just become part of the most desperate improvisation of the war. The Red Ball Express, a name coined just days earlier, was a little more than an idea. Take every available truck, every available driver, run them day and night in a one-way loop, and pray the engines held together. Drivers ran on caffeine and fear. Trucks ran until their brakes melted and their tires shredded. Rookard didn't know this either. He only knew the dust, the endless line of canvas-stopped GMCs, and the feeling that the war, which had seemed enormous and impersonal, now depended on his hands gripping the wheel. He also knew something else. Something. The generals at Chef understood only too late. Patton's advance was not halted by German guns. It was halted by empty gas cans, and on that day, as Rookard bounced along a shattered French road with 600 gallons of fuel sloshing behind him, he realized, without ever putting it into words, that the outcome of campaigns could hinge not on strategy or heroism, but on whether a 23-year-old truck driver reached his destination before his tank ran dry. The American problem. A machine that had outrun its Flulu. Planners assumed the advance across. France would look like the First World War, with better maps. A slow, grinding push, secure ports, repaired railroads. Supply depots leapfrogged forward in carefully measured stages. The entire logistical design depended on predictability, on a front line that stayed put long enough to be supplied properly. Patton shattered that assumption. His spearheads could cover 80 miles in a day. A truck convoy hauling fuel from Normandy could not. Every mile forward stretched the supply line like a rubber band. By August, the band was snapping. Trucks were burning nearly as much fuel driving supplies forward as the tanks were burning using it. Drivers were collapsing from exhaustion. Maintenance crews were cannibalizing wrecked trucks. Just to keep the surviving ones running, Ammunition depots emptied faster than ships could unload. Food rations dipped. Medical supplies ran thin. Spare parts disappeared. All because the American system designed to feed a mechanized giant had been pushed far beyond its intended tempo. The German backward. Miracle. A logistics system built on hooves. What baffled the Americans was that the German First Army, retreating across France with its supply lines collapsing, somehow still managed to function. It shouldn't have been possible, but the Germans had spent decades perfecting a logistics system powered not by internal combustion engines but by horses, and horses don't need gasoline. Roads, machine shops, or depots, every German infantry division brought with it a village's worth of animals. 2,652 horses per standard infantry division in 1943. 4,000 to 6,000 horses per division early in the war. Over 1 million horses in service at any time. 5 million in total passed through the German army. By 1945, these animals could cross terrain that would immobilize trucks, eat grass from fields the Germans were retreating through, pull wagons full of artillery shells, rations, or wounded soldiers without needing a single drop of fuel, continue operating even when roads were cratered, bridges blown, or gasoline depots bombed flat. What looked archaic to the Americans was, in practice, the only system that could survive in a strategic environment where fuel was scarce. Factories were bombed, and the Luftwaffe no longer controlled the skies. Two armies, two worlds. Patton's Third Army ran on engines and speed. The German First Army ran on endurance and horses. The Americans were paralyzed because their fuel was 200 meters away. The Germans were mobile because their fuel grew along the roadside. And Rookard, sitting on the beaches in his empty truck, waiting for orders, was caught between these worlds. He was part of a modern machine so powerful it could remake continents, yet so fragile that a broken truck axle or a missing fuel convoy could freeze an entire army in place. That was the strange truth of the summer of 1944. The most advanced army in the world was brought to a halt, while one of the most backward kept moving. The German dilemma: running an industrial war on pre-industrial logistics. The German High Command understood perfectly well that horses were an economic and operational disaster. They weren't nostalgic or stupid, they were desperate. Germany lacked adequate oil reserves, sufficient refining capacity, or materials for large-scale truck production. Protected supply lines that could survive Allied bombing given those constraints. The result was inevitable: a logistics system built around animals. But the math was merciless. A horse could haul a wagon 25 miles, die in ideal conditions. A horse consumed 12 pounds of grain every day, whether moving or idle. A 1943 infantry division needed 53 tons of fodder daily, just to keep its horse fleet alive. That fodder had to be hauled forward by more horses, burning more fodder. The Germans had done the calculations. They knew that beyond 25 miles from a railhead, a horse-drawn division becomes self-cannibalizing. All additional hauling capacity gets consumed, feeding the animals doing the hauling. It was a logistical perpetual motion. It's a machine that didn't work. The only reason it functioned at all was that the front lines in France were close to railheads, moving slowly until July 1944, when the Allies broke through at St. Lay. The horse-based system began to disintegrate. The Germans were feeding horses faster than they were supplying divisions. They were losing animals to exhaustion and air attack faster than they could replace them. The whole apparatus was grinding itself into dust. Yet, ironically, at the end of August 1944, it still worked slightly better than the American system, because the Germans always had one thing on hand: horses didn't need gasoline. The American paradox: fuel everywhere and none for the Frontin theory. The U.S. Army had solved all these problems. Trucks didn't eat. Trucks didn't rest. Trucks didn't reproduce logistical drag by requiring more trucks to feed them. A single truck convoy could move supplies 10 to 12 times farther per day than a horse-drawn column. In practice, on August 31, 1944, millions of gallons of gasoline were right there. On the beach, in drums, Tens of thousands of tons of ammunition and rations sat stacked under camouflage netting. Drivers like Rookard were present. Engines ready. Patton's spearheads were waiting just a few hours. Drive away. The United States. It had fuel. It had engines. It had manpower. It had the best logistics doctrine in the world. What it didn't have was capacity. Not enough trucks to haul fuel and ammunition and food and spare parts simultaneously over a 300-mile supply line. So the greatest mechanized army in human history stalled, and in that moment, the contrast between the two systems became almost philosophical. The Germans were collapsing because their logistics were stuck in the 19th century. The Americans were stalling because their logistics were already in the 20th century but not quite big enough. For the 20th century war, they were fighting 2 armies, 2 failures, 1 truth horses were killing the German army, fuel shortages were freezing the American one. And between them was the absurd fact that defined the end of August. 1944. The U.S. Army had solved every logistical problem in theory, except the problem of success. In the first days of August, it had even felt smooth. Rookard remembered it clearly. Short hauls, good roads, plenty of rest. The sense that the whole machine was working the way the manuals said it was supposed to. You picked up a load, you drove it 30 or 50 miles, you dropped it, and you were done. The front was close, the depots were full, and the supply lines were compact and sane. But that was before Patton shattered the map, as Third Army surged across France. Every extra mile the tanks advanced meant 1 more mile the trucks had to cover. That was the math that not the drivers, not the planners, not even Patton could escape. A 50-mile round trip became 120, then 180, then 220. By the time the advance reached the Seine, the supply line had doubled. By the time Patton was near the Meuse, it had quadrupled, and each mile made the trucks bleed a little faster. A 400-mile gamble Rookard. Its run that morning 400 miles out and back wasn't a heroic exception. It was normal. The average day had become something that would have been considered reckless, even impossible, just a month earlier. Drivers joked about it. Because the alternative was crying 54 hours round trip, 4 hours of sleep, 1 hot meal if you were lucky, no showers, no maintenance, downtime, no backup crews. They drove until their eyes burned. They drove until their knuckles cramped into claws around the wheel. They drove because the only other option was to stop. To stop was to fail the men at the front. And always the fear. Don't fall asleep. Don't drift. Don't hit the ditch. If you go over, no one stops. The convoy can't stop. More than 1 truck had been found half crumpled in a field with its driver slumped over the wheel, breathing but barely conscious. The officers had ordered them evacuated like casualties, because they were casualties at different front. But the same war, machines failing like Menthe trucks were dying. 2. Gearboxes screamed as they were forced to haul loads at speeds they weren't built for. Tires wore down to canvas in days, instead of weeks. Radiators boiled over on steep hills, forcing drivers to stop and pray the engine didn't. C's brake drums overheated. From constant convoy braking, shock absorbers, snapped from potholes, that grew deeper every time another 3-ton truck slammed into them. French roads that had once been quaint countryside, lanes were now shattered, scars deep ruts. Broken cobblestone gravel turned to powdered chalk. Locals stood at doorsteps watching the convoys thunder past, a living river of engines and dust. Shaking the glass in their windows, the drivers joked that if German artillery didn't kill them, the suspension would. But no one stopped, because everyone understood one thing. If a truck didn't move, a tank didn't move. If a tank didn't move, Patton didn't move. If Patton didn't move, the breakout died. The breaking point by late August. The system was stretched so thin that it wasn't really a system anymore. It was a gambler rolling act of desperation performed by thousands of exhausted young men trying to outrun the limits of their own bodies and machines. The Americans hadn't been beaten. They hadn't been outmaneuvered. They were simply outrunning themselves. And Rookard, bouncing along in his empty truck, toward those distant beaches, could feel it in the vibration of the steering wheel, in the way the engine coughed on long hills, in the ache behind his eyes. Something was going to give. No army, no matter how modern, how well supplied, how brilliantly led, could keep advancing forever on a supply line that long and that fragile. He didn't know where the breaking point was, but he knew he was driving on it. They called it the Red Ball Express. But the name came later in the moment, in that overheated room on August 22nd. It was just a desperate idea sketched in pencil on a map smeared with fingerprints, sweat, and spilled coffee. Eisengrahl realized that the American truck fleet wasn't failing because it was too small, or too slow, or too fragile. It was failing because it was wasting time in traffic jams, in two-way congestion, in endless coordination delays caused by thousands of independent truck movements snaking across a shattered road network. So they proposed something radical. Turn the supply line into a one-way highway system. No detours, no stops, no oncoming traffic, just an endless loop of trucks. Loaded one way, empty the other. It was elegant in theory, violent in execution. The rules of the Red Ball Expresses plan boiled down to a few uncompromising principles. Dedicated roads, to routes, one outbound, one inbound closed to all other traffic. Military police posted every few miles to enforce it at gunpoint if necessary. No stopping. Ever if a truck broke down, it was shoved off the road. If a driver fell asleep, his buddy shook him awake while the truck stayed rolling. If you slowed the convoy, you endangered the front. Unlimited speed. Within reason, the posted limit was 25 miles per hour. The real limit was whatever kept the line from collapsing. Drivers were pulled from everywhere. Clerks, cooks, riflemen, mechanics, medics, anyone who could steer a truck was put behind a wheel. 24-hour operations, day and night. Headlights off when possible, taillights hooded, engines pounding endlessly through villages, forests and fields. Maximum payload, minimum downtime, no empty loads forward, no delays unloading at the depots. Every minute a truck wasn't rolling was a minute Patton wasn't attacking. Why it worked, though? The genius of the system was that it didn't increase the number of trucks or drivers. It increased the efficiency of every mile driven. No more waiting for oncoming traffic to clear. No more chaotic road networks. No more individual messengers and isolated dispatch decisions. Trucks became a continuous artery, like an assembly line, but stretched across France. It was ugly. It was dangerous. It pushed drivers past every physical and psychological limit. But it worked. The moment it was born by the early hours of August 23rd, Eisengrahl had a prototype map of the route. A looping figure, 8 connecting Normandy to the fast-moving front. When they brought it to Chef, Eisenhower's staff didn't debate it. They didn't analyze it. They didn't send it back for revision. They approved it on the spot because they knew something the drivers on the ground could feel in their bones. The Allied advance had reached the edge of what logistics made possible. The Red Ball Express was the only way to push that edge farther. And so, at dawn on August 25th, as Rookard sat in his cab rubbing exhaustion out of his eyes, military police began hammering Red Ball route no entry signs into French soil, and thousands of trucks began pouring onto a road network that had never been meant for such a burden. It was the start of one of the most extraordinary logistical feats in military history, and for the men behind the wheel, it meant one thing. He didn't have 23,000 drivers. He didn't have anything close to 23,000 drivers, but that was the genius and the insanity of the Red Ball Express. They created what they needed faster than any rational organization should have been able to. Ei's staff scoured the European theater with a kind of manic determination, sending orders down every chain of command they could reach. Send every man who can drive a truck. Send every truck that can make forward movement under its own power. Send mechanics. Send MPs. Send clerks. Send anyone. Truck companies materialized almost overnight, stitched together from units that had never trained together. half from an anti-aircraft regiment, a quarter from an engineer. Battalion, a handful from a chemical smoke company. A sprinkling of riflemen who knew how to double clutch. A few cooks who had driven delivery trucks back home in Georgia or Pennsylvania. It didn't matter where they came from. It didn't matter what their previous mission had been. It didn't matter if they had ever seen a battlefield if you could drive. You were a driver now, the human reality behind the numbers eyes needed. 23,000 drivers. He eventually got nearly 28,000. Most of them African-American soldiers from quartermaster truck, company's men whose skill and endurance became the backbone of the entire system. The 793rd MP Battalion set up traffic checkpoints, patrol stations, and emergency detour sites along hundreds of miles of road. Engineer units patched potholes, rebuilt shoulders, filled craters, and widened hairpin turns sometimes while convoys roared past inches away. Ordnance teams established mobile repair parks that worked like NASCAR pit crews, pulling transmissions and swapping tires in minutes. Quartermasters set up massive loading yards where fuel, ammo, and rations were lined up and pre-configured. Bundles to eliminate loading delays. And at the center of it all was one unbreakable rule. Red Ball trucks had absolute priority. If a tank transporter, ambulance, or staff car blocked the route even for a moment, it was pulled off the road. This wasn't symbolic, it was enforced. Military police carried explicit orders. No vehicle will impede the Red Ball. August 25, 1944. The engine starts turning on the morning of August 25th. The first official Red Ball convoy departed within 48 hours to 6,000. Trucks were on the loop. A convoy passed a given point on the route every 2 minutes, French villagers described. The sound is a constant thunder, day and night. Like living beside an endless industrial machine, Rookard was one of those drivers. Jolted awake, handed a manifest and told, "You're Red Ball now. You don't stop for the next 3 months." Neither did the Express. The impossible had been done the Red Ball. Express didn't solve every problem, but it did the one thing that mattered. It bought time. It kept the Allied advance moving weeks longer than the math said it should have. It kept the Germans from digging in. It kept the war from stretching into 1946. Quartermasters set up massive loading yards where fuel, ammo, and rations were lined up and pre-configured. Bundles to eliminate loading delays. And at the center of it all was one unbreakable rule. Red Ball trucks had absolute priority. If a tank transporter, ambulance, or staff car blocked the route even for a moment, it was pulled off the road. This wasn't symbolic. It was enforced. Military police carried explicit orders. No vehicle will impede the Red Ball. August 25, 1944. The engine starts turning on the morning of August 25th. The first official Red Ball convoy departed. Within 48 hours to 6,000. Trucks were on the loop. A convoy passed a given point on the route every 2 minutes, French villagers described. The sound is a constant thunder, day and night. Like living beside an endless industrial machine, Rookard was one of those drivers. Jolted awake, handed a manifest and told, "You're Red Ball now. You don't stop." For the next 3 months, neither did the Express. The impossible had been done the Red Ball Express. Didn't solve every problem, but it did the one thing that mattered. It bought time. It kept the Allied advance moving weeks longer than the math said it should have. It kept the Germans from digging in. It kept the war from stretching into 1946. And it existed only because men like eyes looked at the laws of logistics, looked at the reality on the ground and said, "We're breaking the rules. We're making new ones." That was the spirit behind the Red Ball Express. That was what kept Patton moving when nothing else could. Rookard was 19 years old, and the army had placed him inside a machine that demanded more from him than anyone back home could have imagined, including the army itself. He wasn't supposed to be here, not according to the SD personnel planners, not according to the officers who believed the real war was fought with rifles. Not steering wheels, but he was here. And so were thousands of other black soldiers who'd been labeled unfit for combat, and then handed the most critical job in Europe: keep the Allied armies alive. The reality behind the wheel, the red ball. Express sounded like a clean, simple system on a map to routes. Endless convoys, priority movement. But to the men who drove it, it was something else entirely. It was fear, it was exhaustion, it was responsibility measured not in miles, but in lives. Danger. Everywhere German planes prowled for moving lights on moonless nights. Jerry artillery teams learned to listen for the constant growl of engines and drop shells on the sound alone. Straggling German infantry cut off, desperate. Angry fired from hedgerows or melted into the trees after pod shots at passing trucks. The red ball. Routes weren't combat zones on paper. They were in practice. Drivers weren't infantry, but they carried rifles anyways, lung awkwardly beside gear they barely had time to use. Most hoped they would never need them, because if you were firing a rifle, something had already gone terribly wrong. Visibility measured in feet driving with the windshield down wasn't bravado. It was survival. Glass reflected moonlight, and moonlight attracted artillery. Blackout. Light, tiny slits of dim green glow gave you just enough visibility to avoid rear-ending the truck. Ahead of you, if you squinted and stayed glued to the road. 30 feet of visibility at 2030 mph. On slick cobblestone. On dirt tracks turned to mud, through rain, fog, dust, clouds, and pitch-black nights. Rookard used to joke that he could identify the truck in front of him just from the shape of the taillight hood. He wasn't joking. Exhaustion that blurred reality after 10 hours. The steering wheel vibrated through your bones. After 15, the road started to shimmer. After 20, the darkness took on shapes, the road curving when it was straight, the horizon tilting. Shadows forming into obstacles that vanished the moment you blinked. Drivers held themselves awake with burnt coffee, cold rations, songs muttered under their breath. Slaps to the face, cigarettes burned down to the filter. The occasional buddy elbowing them hard to keep them conscious, and still some drifted sideways, eased off the road and woke up in a ditch. If they woke up at all, the army underestimated. The army thought these men would be safely behind the lines instead. They were the thin logistical artery stretching from the Normandy beaches to the front, a lifeline that could not break. 3/4 of the Red Ball Express drivers were black. Many were teenagers. Most had grown up in segregated neighborhoods, attended segregated schools, lived under Jim Crow laws, and been drafted into a segregated army. But here, on these dark roads, holding these trucks together with muscle and willpower, they carried the Allied advance on their shoulders. No headlines, no medals, no speeches. Just the unspoken truth that if they stopped, the war stopped. Rookard's World Cleveland had taught him the rhythm of factories, the clang of shift changes, the smell of hot metal, the fatigue of long days. The Red Ball Express was that world multiplied by terror and urgency. He gripped the wheel of a GMC 2.5-ton truck that rattled like a steel skeleton and smelled of oil and canvas. He followed the double red ball markers nailed to posts, barns, shattered stone walls. He prayed the engine wouldn't overheat, the tires wouldn't blow, and the convoy wouldn't be spotted by a Luftwaffe fighter sweeping low over the treetops. And always the same thought: if I don't deliver this, someone at the front doesn't eat, doesn't shoot, doesn't move, doesn't live. It was a burden no one had prepared him for, but he carried it anyway because the trucks couldn't stop, because Patton couldn't stop, because the war itself couldn't stop. And so the Red Ball rolled on, powered by men the army hadn't wanted in combat, but whom history would eventually recognize as the ones who kept the Allied armies alive long enough to win. German stragglers presented another threat. Men who had been cut off in the rapid Allied advance, snipers, small infantry groups, even occasional SS squads hid in woods and farmhouses along the routes. They were desperate, unpredictable, and often more dangerous because they had nothing left to lose. A few fired potshots at convoys, others laid mines. Others tried to slip close enough to steal weapons or supplies. Drivers learned to read the landscape as carefully as they watched the road ahead, a suspicious glint in a hedgerow, a sudden stillness in a farmhouse window, a dirt patch that looked just a little too smooth. But the greatest enemy of all was fatigue. The red ball. Express wasn't really a transportation system, it was a test of human endurance. Drivers worked in rotating shifts that looked reasonable on paper and were impossible in reality. A 2-hour break usually meant 20 minutes of sleep and 80 minutes of waiting, loading, refueling, or being shouted at to get moving again. Men tied belts around their chests to keep themselves upright. Some chewed coffee grounds. Others sang, shouted, or slapped themselves to stay awake. Rookard remembered staring at the tailgate of the truck in front of him so long that it felt like the only object in the universe. And still the convoys rolled, because the front didn't care how tired you were. Patton's Third Army didn't slow down for weather, didn't slow down for the enemy, and certainly didn't slow down for the men hauling its lifeblood. If the tanks reached the Meuse with dry fuel tanks, it was over. If artillery batteries ran out of shells, the Germans would regroup. If the advance stalled, even briefly, the initiative might shift in war. Losing momentum is sometimes as fatal as losing a battle. The Red Ball drivers understood that. They took pride in it. Rookard later said that he didn't feel like a hero. He felt like a man doing a job everyone depended on, but no one paid attention to. He felt anonymous, one more truck in an endless line of trucks. But he also knew something else. Without that line of trucks, the war would grind to a halt. Every mile he drove brought the Allies 1 mile closer to Germany, 1 mile closer to ending the war. 1 mile closer to home, and so he drove. Across shattered roads, under hostile skies. Through exhaustion so deep, it felt like drowning, because the Red Ball Express did not stop. Because it could not stop. Whatever came next. There was no turning back. Secondary routes branched off to supply different army sectors, creating a web of motion arrows of steel and rubber flowing inexorably eastward. The system worked only because every part of it worked. Dispatchers, MPs, mechanics, engineers, loaders, and above all, the drivers who lived behind the wheel. At its peak late August into early September 1944, the Red Ball Express moved about 12,000 tons of supplies per day. That number is so large it's difficult to imagine, but the soldiers at the front understood it perfectly. It meant their tanks kept moving. Their artillery kept firing. Their trucks, half-tracks, and jeeps stayed fueled. Their rations didn't run out. Momentum, strategic, operational. Psychological was purchased 1 jerrycan at a time, and every jerrycan had to be hauled by men like James Rookard. The official statistics tell only part of the story. 1 in every 4 trucks broke down at some point. Some units were running vehicles 22 hours a day. Tires were consumed twice as fast as predicted. Engines overheated. Brakes wore out. Drivers became so fatigued they hallucinated shadows that looked like soldiers, trees that became tanks, the road itself bending in impossible ways. Some men crashed and survived, others didn't. Still, the convoys rolled. By early September, American forces were approaching the German border faster than any planner had expected. They outran their maps, outran their fuel stockpiles, outran the ability of the ports to keep up. Cherbourg and the Normandy beaches were never intended to support such a massive, sustained push. But the Red Ball Express bridged the gap, an improvised artery pumping life into the armies racing across France. The system was brutal, it's inefficient, and unsustainable in the long term. But for those critical weeks, it was enough. It was everything. And when the trucks passed through French towns' thunderous columns of olive-drab machines, drivers slumped over wheels, cat-eye lights glowing like fireflies, people waved. They knew what the trucks meant. They knew what the drivers were doing. The French had seen armies break down before. They had seen offensives stall. They had seen liberation delayed. The Red Ball Express meant it would not be. Delayed again. The drivers didn't wear medals or glory. Their battlefield was the open road. Their weapon was the throttle. Their enemy was fatigue, breakdown, and time itself. Yet the outcome of the campaign in France, its speed. Its decisiveness rested on them. Removing the governors wasn't just disobedience, it was survival. At 25 miles per hour, a truck was a target. At 60 miles per hour, it was a blur in the darkness. The official rules existed on paper. The real red ball rules were written on the road. Keep moving. Don't stop. Don't slow down. If a truck in front of you faltered, you went around it. If your own truck faltered, you prayed you could coax it another mile. Momentum was everything. The highway markers' red circles on white plates became the lifeblood symbols of the advance. Drivers learned to look for them instinctively mile after mile. The signs told them they were still on the artery, still connected to the front, still part of the system that was holding the American offensive together. As long as the red balls pointed the way, the war kept moving forward. The route length itself became a kind of endurance test. For some drivers, particularly those coming from the more distant depots, the round trip could stretch to nearly 700 miles. That meant little or no sleep, constant engine strain navigation in blackout conditions, through towns whose lights were extinguished by curfew dealing with bottlenecks, checkpoints, and sudden congestion where roads narrowed military police checkpoints enforced discipline. MPs waved trucks through nonstop, checked for breakdowns, redirected local traffic, and sometimes physically removed civilian vehicles that wandered onto the route. The MPs were as exhausted as the drivers, standing for hours in rain, dust, or darkness. They knew that one accident, one stalled truck in the wrong spot, could turn into a cascading traffic jam stretching for miles. The engineers were equally relentless. They repaired road surfaces on the fly, pouring gravel, laying planks, patching asphalt, bulldozing rubble. Bridges got emergency reinforcements, sandbags, timbers, steel plates, anything that could carry one more load of fuel across the Seine or the Oise. Some bridges sagged, under the strain but held long enough for the convoys to pass. Others failed, and alternate routes were created within hours. The entire highway network became a dynamic system. It's constantly flexing and reshaping as demands grew. Back at the beaches, loading operations never stopped. Cargo ships disgorged mountains of supplies onto the sand, jerry cans, spare tank tracks, radio equipment. Rations material of every kind poured into the logistical bloodstream. Quartermasters organized what they could, improvised what they couldn't. They were working at a tempo no doctrine had imagined. Drivers felt that chaos directly. They'd backed their trucks into loading lanes with only inches between them. Forklifts screeched. Officers yelled. Pallets broke. Cargo tumbled. And when the tailgate slammed shut, the clock started. A fully loaded truck was a promise to the men at the front, and that promise had to be kept. Rules required 60-yard intervals. Reality often gave them 6 feet. The roads, packed shoulder to shoulder, became living conveyor belts of steel and diesel fumes. Drivers who pushed their trucks to 50, 60, even 70 miles per hour did so knowing the risks, blowouts, rollovers, collisions, but also knowing that Patton's tanks needed that fuel now, not later, and still the convoys kept moving. The Red Ball Express was not elegant. It was not efficient. It was not safe, but it worked. It worked because thousands of exhausted, undertrained, underappreciated drivers made it work. It worked because officers like Eisengrahl refused to accept that distance and fatigue and road conditions made it impossible. It worked because, for a few crucial weeks in 1944, a nation's industrial might was translated into motion raw. Unstoppable motion, one truck at a time. It was logistics at its most desperate and its most brilliant. The trucks became extensions of the drivers themselves. The machines pushed beyond design limits, and men pushed beyond human limits. Each GMC 2.5-ton truck was a fragile lifeline, yet together they formed an unstoppable current. Engines roared, as if in defiance of their wear. Gearboxes screamed under strain. Tires shredded on stone and mud. Radiators boiled over, but the trucks kept moving because the front demanded it. Mechanics worked like surgeons under battlefield conditions. They swapped engines in open fields, rebuilt transmissions beside the road. welded axles with whatever scrap metal was available. Broken trucks were cannibalized for parts, creating a grim ecosystem where the life of one vehicle sustained another. Improvisation became a science. Desperation became method. Every repair was temporary, every fix a gamble, but it was enough. It had to be. Drivers adapted to the rhythm of the express. Alone on the road, sometimes for 20 hours straight, they memorized every mile, every sharp turn, every weak bridge, every muddy patch that could swallow a wheel. Darkness ceased to be an obstacle. It became a constant companion. Partners shared the burden when they could. One slept while the other drove, but often there was no partner. Only the lonely hum of the engine and the vibrating wheel in the hands of a man too tired to remember why he had started sleep. When it came, was stolen in fragments, 10 minutes in a ditch, half an hour across crates of ammunition, a moment of unconsciousness as the truck coasted downhill. Coffee kept the eyes open. Benzodrine kept the hands steady. Sheer stubborn will kept the trucks moving mile after mile. Every mile delivered fuel, shells, food, and hope to the men at the front. The Red Ball Express was chaos turned into motion. It was human endurance measured in steel and gasoline. It was terrifying, exhausting, and relentless, but it worked. And as the trucks rolled eastward across the scarred French landscape, the drivers black and white, trained and untrained, frightened and determined, kept the heart of the Allied advance beating. One overworked engine at a time. That was the quiet truth of the Red Ball Express to the planners and headquarters. Rookard was a number, a truck, a cog in a logistical machine. To the officers at the depots, he was part of the daily grind, just another driver coming and going, making deliveries that never stopped, never slowed, never paused for recognition. But at the front, the story was different. Every tank that rumbled past, every artillery battery that fired without pause, every infantry unit that advanced owed its movement to men like him. Rookard didn't see the victory he enabled. He didn't watch Patton's tanks roll east on September 2nd. He didn't see the First Army reach its objectives. He only knew the hum of his engine, the shaking of the cab over broken French roads, the endless rhythm of loading, driving, unloading, and returning, and he drove on. The numbers were staggering. 412,193 tons of supplies delivered in under 3 months. 12,342 tons per day at peak capacity. Trucks covered 48 million miles. Over 40,000. Tires destroyed in the first month alone. Hundreds of thousands of gallons of fuel consumed. Just to deliver fuel, every statistic was a testament to human endurance, ingenuity, and sheer determination. Mechanics who patched engines by flashlight. Drivers who learned to sleep in 10-minute intervals. Engineers who kept bridges from collapsing. MPs who kept traffic flowing. And drivers, thousands of them, black and white, trained and untrained, ordinary and extraordinary, who kept the arteries of war alive. The tank driver from the 5th Armored Division put it simply, if it wasn't for the Red Ball, we couldn't have moved. That was the unspoken acknowledgement of the Red Ball Express. The Army moved not because of generals, not because of tanks, not because of strategy alone, but because 1,000 lonely drivers. Behind the wheel of battered trucks, delivered the fuel, ammunition, and supplies that made movement possible, Rookard was just a truck driver to most. To the men racing across France, he was indispensable. Every mile he drove kept the advance alive, kept the tanks rolling, kept Patton moving in doing so. Changed the course of the war. The Red Ball Express didn't just deliver supplies. It rewrote the rules of war for generations. Armies had measured their limits by supply lines. Tanks could only advance as far as fuel allowed. Artillery could only fire as long as ammunition arrived. Infantry could only march as far as food and water permitted. Traditionally, a long advance meant pauses, consolidation, resupply, regrouping. The American doctrine had always acknowledged this constraint, and the Germans expected it. But in 1944, a convoy of tired, black truck drivers, Rookard among them, proved the old assumptions wrong. They moved fuel under fire, in darkness, across shattered roads, through rain and mud. With German aircraft still overhead and stragglers firing from the hedgerows, they kept tanks rolling and artillery firing. They turned logistics into a weapon. Patton recognized it immediately. He rarely praised anyone, but he told his staff that the 2.5-ton truck was the most valuable weapon in the army. Colonel John S.D. Eisenhower later confirmed that the advance across France would have been impossible without them. It wasn't flattery. It was recognition of a fundamental truth. Mobility, momentum, and victory depend on logistics as much as on tactics or firepower. The Red Ball Express changed military thinking in real time. American commanders saw that doctrine wasn't immutable. If you had enough trucks, enough fuel, and enough determination, the army could advance continuously, maintain pressure, and keep the enemy off balance indefinitely. A 400-mile advance in a month, once considered impossible, became achievable. The psychological impact on German forces was profound. Intelligence officers analyzed the American advance and expected disaster for the Allies once supply lines extended hundreds of miles. Instead, the Americans kept moving. Their ability to sustain operations outstripped German logistics. Counteroffensives, previously calculated on the assumption that the Americans would pause, became impossible. In effect, the Red Ball Express didn't just supply an army. It reshaped the battlefield itself. Every mile driven, every jerrycan delivered, every exhausted driver returning for another load, these were the invisible arms that ensured momentum. The Germans realized that the advantage they had assumed long overextended supply lines had vanished. They weren't facing a normal army. They were facing a machine that could move faster than they could predict, fight longer than they could endure, and sustain itself in ways their own logistics could not match. Rookard and his fellow drivers didn't just haul fuel. They redefined what it meant to advance in modern warfare, proving that speed, endurance, and logistics could be as decisive as firepower on the front lines. Exactly. The contrast was brutal and decisive. By late summer 1944, the Red Ball Express and the American truck-based logistics network had turned supply into a force multiplier. Tanks, artillery, and infantry could advance hundreds of miles without pause because trucks carried everything they needed. Moving faster than the soldiers could march or the horses could pull, fuel, ammunition, rations, medical supplies, and spare parts arrived at the front in hours, not days. Even when roads were damaged, whether it was bad or trucks broke down, the system adapted. One broken truck didn't stop the line. 5 more filled the gap. Meanwhile, German divisions were collapsing under the weight of their own supply system. Their reliance on horses created a rigid, slow-moving chain. Every infantry division required thousands of horses. Every horse required feed, water, rest, and replacement when it died. The farther a German unit moved from a railhead, the more of its own transport capacity was consumed, simply hauling fodder for the animals that hauled the supplies. By September, German units were operating 90 miles from the nearest railhead. Far beyond the 25-mile limit their logistics allowed, their supply columns crawled along at walking speed. Equipment was abandoned. Operations stalled. Soldiers went hungry and unarmed. The strategic implications were enormous. American commanders, confident in their mobile supply system, could plan rapid advances, deep penetrations, and continuous pressure. German commanders, shackled by slow, fragile, horse-based logistics, could only plan conservatively, limit offensive maneuvers, and react defensively. Every German counterattack risked outrunning its own supplies, turning the army into a hollow shell of infantry with empty stomachs and spent ammunition, in essence. Logistics became a battlefield weapon. The Americans didn't just fight faster, they'd sustain speed. The Germans couldn't. That difference dictated outcomes across the French campaign, forced German commanders to adjust strategy constantly, and made the Red Ball Express and the men like Rookard driving it one of the most decisive factors in the Allied advance. The lesson was clear. In modern mechanized warfare, the army that moves first and keeps moving isn't just stronger, it is nearly unstoppable. Exactly dash. Logistics wasn't just about fuel or ammunition. It was survival, and mechanization was decisive. The Germans had seen the consequences of relying on animal transport before. In Russia, during the winter of 1941, their advance on Moscow collapsed not because German soldiers lacked courage or training, but because horses literally froze to death and supply wagons couldn't move. Ammunition, food, and medical supplies couldn't reach the front, and the army ground to a halt. The bitter memory of that failure shaped German thinking, but by 1944, they still hadn't solved the underlying problem. By contrast, American logistics had embraced mechanical mobility on a scale never attempted before. Trucks didn't freeze to death. Engines could run in cold, wet, or muddy conditions. Fuel could be delivered across hundreds of miles at speeds impossible for horse-drawn wagons. The men of the Red Ball, expressed mostly young black drivers like Rookard, embodied this transformation. They were not just moving supplies. They were delivering the future of warfare. German intelligence noticed. Reports from First Army headquarters noted. American supply columns moved at speeds that made horse transport obsolete. Trucks operated in conditions that immobilized horses. The logistical burden of feed for animals was eliminated. Sustained advances over hundreds of miles were now possible. The reports concluded bluntly. Unless Germany could match American mobility, the war was lost. And they were right. The lessons of Russia's winter, the death of thousands of horses, the stalling of offensives were repeated in miniature in France. Not from weather, but from the relentless pace of mechanized supply. The Red Ball Express wasn't glamorous. It wasn't a battlefield in the traditional sense, but in terms of strategic impact, it was decisive. It proved that mechanical logistics could outmatch any army dependent on animal transport. And it forced the Germans to confront a reality they could neither undo nor overcome. The future of warfare had arrived, barreling eastward across France. 1 2.5-ton truck at a time. Exactly the Red Ball Express had bridged the gap until permanent ports could take over. By November 1944, Antwerp was operational, allowing supplies to flow directly from the sea rather than relying entirely on hundreds of miles of truck convoys from Normandy. But the significance of the Express went far beyond just getting fuel and ammunition to the front. The contrast between American and German logistics illustrated a fundamental truth of modern warfare. Mechanical mobility scales with industrial capacity. While animal-based systems collapse under strain, weather, and distance, German horses couldn't survive Russian winters. They couldn't carry enough food or ammo to keep divisions supplied at the rapid tempo the Americans demanded. They couldn't adapt to roads destroyed by combat or weather. American trucks, by contrast, ran day and night in snow or heat, mud or rain, hauling thousands of tons of supplies across hundreds of miles. When one broke down, it was replaced. When one driver became exhausted, another took over. The system was resilient, flexible, and relentless. The difference wasn't just machines, it was strategic vision. The U.S. had built an army that operated like its industrial base, fast, scalable, and self-sustaining. Tanks from Detroit could be fueled and armed at the front. Artillery could keep firing. Infantry could keep advancing. Germany, for all its technological sophistication and weapons, remained tied to logistics that belonged in the 19th century: horses, wagons, and fragile supply lines. That mismatch dictated defeat long before the first shot was fired in the next engagement. By November, the Red Ball Express had completed its mission. It had kept Patton's Third Army moving across France, sustained the First Army, and proved the power of industrialized, mechanized logistics. It had shown the Allies and the Germans what modern warfare truly required: speed, endurance, and an endless stream of trucks that never stopped moving. Exactly. The Red Ball Express redefined the very concept of warfare. It showed that supply lines could be as decisive as artillery, that movement and momentum were weapons in their own right, and that human endurance combined with industrial power could overcome what once seemed impossible. For 82 days, tired, often undertrained drivers, many of them young black soldiers like James Rookard, kept thousands of tons of fuel, ammunition, food, and medical supplies flowing across hundreds of miles. They didn't just support combat, they enabled it. Tanks advanced, artillery fired, and infantry moved because trucks moved first. Logistics became a front-line weapon. The drivers were combatants in every sense. When the Red Ball ended on November 16, 1944, the crisis was over, but the lessons endured. Priority routes. Certain roads became lifelines where everything else yielded. Centralized control. Coordination across units allowed a fractured theater to operate as one system. Continuous movement. Momentum mattered more than perfect order. The flow of supplies could never pause. These principles influenced decades of military planning from Korea to Vietnam and beyond. They reshaped civilian logistics, too. Eisenhower's push for the interstate highway system was informed by what he saw in France. Good roads mean rapid movement, and rapid movement saves lives. Modern supply chains, with their emphasis on just-in-time delivery and continuous transport, carry forward the lessons learned by those drivers racing day and night across war-torn France. Most importantly, the Red Ball Express proved a fundamental truth. Logistics is combat. You can fire the best rifles, maneuver the fastest tanks, and plan the most brilliant strategies, but without supplies delivered on time, all of it stops. And the men behind the wheel of those trucks, often overlooked and underestimated, were just as crucial to victory as the soldiers storming the front lines. In 1944, across the scarred French countryside, a new kind of warfare was born, and its heartbeat was the Red Ball Express. Exactly. James Rookard and his fellow drivers embodied a transformation in warfare that few recognized at the time. They weren't generals, strategists, or tank commanders. They were mostly young men, often black, drafted into a system that underestimated them. Yet for 82 intense, grueling days, they became the lifeblood of the Allied advance across France. Every mile they drove, every jerrycan delivered. Every engine coaxed past its limits, kept Patton's tanks rolling, artillery firing, and infantry moving. The contrast with Germany was stark. While American divisions were fully motorized, supplied by a modern industrial machine capable of delivering fuel, ammunition, and food across hundreds of miles, the German army remained shackled to horses and wagons, a system centuries old. By 1944, only 42 of 264 German combat divisions were motorized. The rest relied on animal power that was slow, fragile, and inflexible. By the war's end, Germany still had over 1 million horses in military service. While the U.S. had produced over 2 million trucks, it wasn't just numbers, it was vision. The Red Ball Express proved that logistics is not support, it is combat. The war was won not just on the battlefield, but on the roads of France. By teenagers in olive-drab trucks, under fire, fatigue, and impossible conditions. Without their relentless work, the pace of the Allied advance could not have been sustained, and the liberation of Europe would have taken far longer. At far greater cost, James Rookard survived the war, carrying with him the quiet legacy of that effort, a legacy that reshaped military doctrine, proved the value of industrialized logistics, and highlighted the courage and resilience of ordinary men doing extraordinary work. In the history of World War II, the Red Ball Express stands as a testament to how vision, industry, and human determination can change the course of history, one truck at a time. Exactly, Rookard's story highlights a bitter irony of the era. On the battlefield, he was indispensable, a linchpin in a logistical machine that moved armies and shaped the course of the war. Yet at home, the society he helped defend treated him as second class, blind to the extraordinary work he had done. Driving a truck, keeping convoys moving under fire and exhaustion, delivering the supplies that kept Patton's advance alive, these were acts of heroism, but in Cleveland. That skill was simply driving a truck. The Red Ball drivers' achievements were monumental, yet their recognition was often limited to official commendations that couldn't undo social prejudice or economic barriers. Banks denied mortgages. Employers ignored experience earned in war. Neighborhoods remained segregated. Still, like Rookard, many adapted. They applied the skills learned under impossible conditions to civilian life driving. Logistics, commerce quietly carrying forward the discipline, endurance, and precision forged during the war. The story of Rookard and his fellow drivers is a reminder that heroism doesn't always look like medals or headlines. Sometimes it looks like sheer persistence, competence under pressure, and dedication to a mission larger than oneself. They didn't just drive trucks, they kept history in motion. Even if the world at home failed to fully acknowledge them, their legacy lives on in military logistics doctrine, in the concept of mechanized mobility, and in the very roads and highways that connect modern cities, a testament to the courage and skill of young men who, after fire and fatigue, kept an army moving. Exactly, Rookard's later years underscore both the injustice and the resilience of the Red Ball drivers. For decades, their service went largely unrecognized. Not because it lacked importance, but because society refused to acknowledge the full humanity and capability of black soldiers. They had risked their lives under fire, mastered machinery under extreme stress, and enabled one of the fastest military advances in history, yet at home. Segregation, discrimination, and systemic barriers often reduced their heroism to anonymity. By 1999, the world was finally listening. Rookard's recollections, the cat-eye lights, the relentless driving, the breakdowns and repairs, the endless back and forth, trips painted a vivid picture of courage and endurance that few could imagine. His words, "We hauled anything General Patton needed. Back and forth. Back and forth," convey the essence of a mission that was invisible in the moment, but crucial in outcome. Stories like Washington, Rector's highlight another layer of the struggle, the deliberate erasure of black contributions from collective memory. Racial segregation was so entrenched that even decades later, white veterans could complete their service alongside black Red Ball drivers without realizing it. The Red Ball Express was not just a feat of logistics, it was a testament to the abilities and resilience of black Americans, accomplished under conditions of war and discrimination. In the end, recognition came slowly, long after the trucks had stopped rolling. But by telling their stories, historians and journalists ensured that the courage, skill, and impact of men like Rookard and Rector would no longer be forgotten. They had not only moved supplies, they had moved the needle on what could be achieved when given opportunity and responsibility. Even in a society that resisted acknowledging it, exactly the Red Ball Express was less about hardware and more about human courage and endurance. The trucks were vital, but without the men behind the wheels, none of it would have mattered. James Rookard, Washington Rector, and the thousands of other drivers transformed what many considered mundane work hauling fuel, ammunition, and supplies into a decisive instrument of war. The story of the Red Ball Express also exposes the cruel irony of invisibility. Most of the drivers were black, yet their contributions were hidden by segregation and prejudice. They weren't featured in films, celebrated in parades, or widely awarded medals. Civilians, and even some fellow soldiers, were unaware of the scale and heroism of their work. Yet within the Army, the generals and logistics officers understood perfectly, without the Express, Patton's advance would have stalled, giving Germany time to regroup, fortify, and prolong the war. The Red Ball Express proved a simple but profound truth. Logistics is combat. Speed, endurance, and relentless movement could decide the outcome of a campaign as surely as any battle. If your supplies move faster than the enemy's, if your drivers can work without pause, and if your vehicles reach the front under any conditions, the Army can continue to press, adapt, and win. It wasn't the tanks, the planes, or the generals alone that kept Third Army moving. It was the young men behind the wheel, often dismissed by the Army itself, who drove 400-mile round trips through mud, rain, and artillery fire for hours without rest. They were told they weren't fit for exactly. The contrast between German and American approaches to logistics highlights a profound difference in military philosophy. For the Germans, Logistics followed the battle. Constrained by horses, railheads, and fragile supply chains, plans were inherently conservative, designed to work within these limits. A stalled offensive couldn't easily resume because the supply system was rigid. Moving ammunition, fuel, or rations to a new sector took days, if not weeks. Strategy was always constrained by what the army could physically sustain. Brilliant maneuvers were meaningless if the troops and vehicles ran out of supplies. The Americans, by contrast, built strategy around logistics. Modern industrial warfare meant that production, distribution, and mobility were integral to operational planning. The Red Ball Express exemplified this philosophy. Logistics was proactive, flexible, and decisive. Truck convoys could be rerouted overnight. Fuel, ammunition, and food could reach new objectives faster than the enemy could react. Operations weren't limited by supply. They were enabled by it. This difference wasn't abstracted. It affected every battlefield decision. German commanders constantly accounted for what their armies could carry. Americans could focus on what they wanted to accomplish, confident that their supply system could keep up. It turned logistics from a secondary support function into a force multiplier, capable of sustaining momentum, enabling rapid advances, and giving commanders options that the Germans simply did not have. In essence, the Red Ball Express and the men who drove it embodied the American philosophy: control the supply, and you control the battlefield. Combat. They proved they were essential to victory, and in doing so, they reshaped military thinking forever. Exactly, the Red Ball Express wasn't an isolated miracle. It was the clearest, most vivid illustration of a broader philosophy: logistics as an adaptable, decisive instrument of war. American success depended on more than industrial capacity. Trucks alone didn't win the war. The U.S. Army combined production with ingenuity and flexibility. Logistics officers were willing to bend or break doctrine, to concentrate convoys beyond recommended limits, to run vehicles 24/7, to push men past exhaustion. The rules were designed for peacetime, for predictability. War demanded speed, improvisation, and relentless pressure, and the Red Ball Express delivered exactly that. Meanwhile, Germany's reliance on horses was a profound strategic handicap. Millions of animals required feed, care, and rest. They moved slowly and died easily in cold, muddy, or snowy conditions. Every division tied to horses was limited by a system built for the 19th century. While the Americans exploited the 20th century's industrial advantages to maximum effect, in the end, America's trucks and the men who drove them were a decisive weapon. They kept armies fueled, armed, and moving. They enabled rapid advances and continuous pressure. They turned logistics into combat power. The Red Ball Express proved that in modern war, momentum is maintained by wheels and engines as much as by guns and tanks. And the soldiers behind the wheel, often underestimated, often invisible, were essential to victory. Exactly, the Red Ball Express shows that victory often hinges on the unsung, unglamorous work of ordinary people doing extraordinary things. It wasn't flashy tactics or daring charges that made the difference in 1944. It was 19-year-old drivers like James Rookard, mechanics repairing trucks by flashlight in the middle of the night, and officers like Colonel Eyes refusing to accept limits in just 82 to 83 days. The Red Ball Express moved over 412,000 tons of supplies, kept two armies advancing, and helped shorten the war all thanks to trucks, determination, and sheer human endurance. It's a story of innovation, perseverance, and courage that challenges traditional notions of heroism. Remembering these stories matters, because it reminds us that every role in war, no matter how overlooked, can be decisive. The trucks didn't fight, but without them, battles couldn't be fought. The drivers didn't get medals for much of their work, but their contribution was essential to victory. Sharing and discussing these histories ensures that the efforts of people like Rookard and the Red Ball drivers are never forgotten. They prove that logistics is combat, and commitment is a weapon just as powerful as any artillery shell or tank.